Okay, this is a little recording about the grid, little tutorial. So what I can do is I can start off by making a very basic grid in, say, AutoCAD or by hand. And in this case I've made a 5 by 5 meter grid, and it's just a basic gridiron. It doesn't mean anything, it's just an abstract organizing principle. It's not a series of rooms, or it's not a specific measurement, it doesn't have to be. Now once I've made a grid like this, what I can do is I can elaborate it on it a little bit. In this case here I've made a tartan grid. And you can see how with the tartan grid I could develop Louis Kahn's idea of served and serving spaces. So those little rectangles and the smaller squares could be serving spaces, and the bigger rectangles, the bigger squares, or a group of them, could be served spaces. Now I'm not limited to a basic tartan grid. I could elaborate on it even further if I wanted to. In this case what I've done is I've just messed around with the leftmost bay. I've just shifted it up a little bit. I could have done all sorts of things. I could have turned it through angles. I could have done, I could have made the original tartan grid even more elaborate than it originally was. But in this case, I'm just demonstrating that I did this because I had in mind to create small rooms, or if I were designing a library, let's say, reading pods. So I could have a system that allows me to have reading pods and maybe a corridor, and then a grid system which would allow me to organize a book display area, let's say. So I might end up with something a little bit like this, where I've got individual reading pods and a corridor and a book display area, let's say, and the stairs that can bring me down to a lecture theatre or up to a lecture theatre or reading space. And maybe I could have bathrooms or kitchenettes or whatever organized into this grid system as well. Now the grid system is an organizing principle. Excuse me. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to end up with something that's just a basic rectangular geometric shaped building. So for example, starting off with that basic grid that I just showed you, I could easily just transform the grid, distort it, and warp it in various different ways in order to be able to get a building that has a much more interesting geometry. Now some of you are doing this already. I know Rory is, and Aidan, you asked me questions about this very specific thing. The idea behind it is that if I wanted to have a building with an extraordinary plan, like the one in front of me here, and a very extraordinary form, if I were to start off with the outline of that form and draw it, and then try to design the spaces on the inside of what is the form, it'd be very difficult for me to do. I'd end up with all sorts of very extraordinary shapes which I mightn't be able to form into a system, and which mightn't be very useful to me. But if I do it the other way around, if I start by getting the organizing principle correct initially, and then if I make sure that I have all the bits of the building where I want them to be, and if I have the building working in a systematic way, then I can distort the grid so that I can create a building that has just an extraordinary form, if that's what I want, or to be able to work with a difficult or tricky site. So that's just a little trick. It's a little way of doing it. Now it's not the only way. If you want to get into doing fold type architecture, there are other ways of doing it that are a little bit more complex and require a bit of thought. But as a way of starting off working in making this type of architecture, I think using a grid in this way is very useful, at least in first year.